Here is my story. I met my wife, Catherine, in high school. We met a day before prom night. Neither of us had dates. So we decided to go together. She was the most beautiful girl I had ever met. That's where we hit it off. We dated for 5 years before getting married at a young age. My wife had a drinking problem and she was once caught up in a drink-and-drive case, but I took care of her and she recovered. We were always the so-in-love couple in our family and friends. 1 year into our marriage, we welcomed our boy, Adam. We were a complete family. Everything I ever wished for. The only thing lacking in our life was that I didn't earn well. I worked at a government organization, although it didn't affect me. My wife sometimes complained about not having good things. She wanted me to take bribes and be rich overnight, but it wasn't the life I wanted. My wife was from a middle-class family, but she liked expensive things. She was beautiful, she knew it and was proud of it. She had a huge social circle of rich friends. She often went to their parties, wearing borrowed clothes or clothes she bought from expensive shops that she would return the next day. She was a wannabe. Nevertheless, I loved her with all my heart and she loved me too. Until one day I took my wife to an office party, we got ready and instead of going by the tube, my wife insisted we call an Uber Lux. We obviously couldn't afford an Uber Lux because of its high prices. My wife argued that the dress she bought would get ruined if she wore it on the tube and she wouldn't be able to return it. She became upset and this wasn't what I wanted. So I convinced her we could order an Uber ride instead of an Uber Lux. When the car arrived, my wife seemed irritated. She told me I would be cheap forever. I tried to cheer her up on the way, but she remained frustrated. My wife suddenly held my hand and laughed as we entered the party. It was one of the things I didn't like about her, her fake laugh. It irritated the hell out of me, but I still tolerated it because I loved my wife. She was stunned by how fancy the party was. There was expensive wine and dishes everywhere. My wife had a few drinks and I stopped her before she could have any more and get out of control. She had a drinking problem since she was a teenager and was once charged with a drink-and-drive case. My wife pointed out how luxurious the dresses of other women were. She started complaining about her dress and I told her she was the most beautiful woman at the party. My wife wasn't impressed by my compliment. My wife wanted to go home, but I told her to wait a little longer as I wanted her to meet my boss. She wasn't interested, but I insisted and she decided to stay. I saw that my boss was free. So I took my wife to meet him. My boss James is usually dry, but he was surprisingly happy when he saw me and my wife. It was a little weird, but I thought it might be because it was a special occasion. He greeted me and my wife and started talking. He joked that he didn't know I had such a beautiful wife. I counted it as a compliment and my wife was pleased. She loved being praised. We three were talking when one of my co-workers called me. I excused myself and went to meet him after a while. When I came back, my wife told me she invited my boss to dinner tomorrow. I was glad about it. It was a good gesture. The next day, my wife got up early and started cleaning the house. It was nothing out of the ordinary. My wife came from the dressing room wearing a deep neck dress that I bought for her for our anniversary, which was next week. I asked her why she wore the anniversary dress today and that it was a little revealing. She sounded irritated, told me this was more important than our anniversary and told me not to be so conservative. She said a rich man was coming to our house which could bring many opportunities at dinner time. My boss came with gifts. My wife served us dinner and after that, my boss took one of the gifts out and opened it. It was a locket for my wife. My wife was overjoyed. She thanked him and instantly took off the locket. I gave her on her birthday and wore that locket. I felt sad that my wife preferred an expensive locket over the locket. I gave her my boss brought a watch for me too and thus, it wasn't suspicious that he got an expensive gift for her. After my boss went home, my wife was all praises about him. I agreed that he was very generous. My wife was always around our son during the daytime and only went out when I was home to care for him. On our anniversary day, I came home early to surprise my wife. When I entered my house, I saw that nobody was home. I thought my wife and son had gone to the park or something. I sat down to drink a glass of water. When the bell rang, I thought it was my wife and son. But when I opened the door, it was my neighbor with my son. She said that she had to go somewhere, so she had to bring him back. I didn't know why he was at my neighbor's house in the first place and where my wife was. After thanking the neighbor for having him, I closed the door and asked my son what was happening. He told me that my wife was going out for a few days and leaving him with the neighbor. It was a little suspicious. When my wife came home, I asked her about this and she replied that she was planning a surprise for our anniversary. I was revealed and asked her what the surprise was. She seemed a little irritated and told me it was dinner. We both got ready and went for dinner. I was shocked to see that it was one of the most expensive restaurants in the city. I told my wife we couldn't afford this, but she hissed at me not to create a scene here. I silently went in with her. My wife went in and asked the receptionist for a table of 2 under the name Catherine. The receptionist Rick confirmed that it was Catherine and James. My wife started acting a little weird. She was irritated and said it was under Catherine and John. The receptionist checked and told us there was no reservation for Catherine and John. My wife went out hissing about how bad the customer service was without saying another word. I told my wife it was okay. And we ate dinner at a local restaurant. My wife didn't say a word during it. A few days passed. And my boss started visiting my cabin often. He seemed to be happy with my work. One day, he called me into his cabin and told me he wanted to invite me to dinner at his house on Sunday. I was surprised because my boss had never invited anyone to his house. I accepted his invitation. When I told my wife about the invitation, she became really happy. She seemed as if Cinderella was invited to the ball. Only if I could understand it was finally Sunday and my wife and I got ready. My wife insisted that we don't take our son because he might break anything. I wanted to take him and go as a family. But my wife argued. So I gave up and asked a neighbor to take care of our son because I couldn't afford a nanny. Upon arriving at his house, my wife got out of the car and started walking. When I tried to hold her hand, she brushed me off. I thought that she was upset about the anniversary dinner. My boss warmly welcomed us. My wife and my boss talked through the dinner. I was a little quiet because I'm an introvert. But this behavior wasn't unusual because my wife is an extrovert. During the dinner, I got a call from my mother. I couldn't hear her. So I went to talk to my mother. It took me a while and when I returned, I saw my boss's hand on my wife's face. I stood there shocked. Then my boss looked at me and said my wife had something in her eye. He said it so casually that I had no reason to doubt it. After the dinner, my boss offered my wife a job at our office. He said that she was the right person to be his assistant. My wife agreed to it. It was a little weird because my wife had never wanted to work. My wife started working at the office and we put her son in a daycare. I was happy to see my wife at work, but she usually ignored me. I thought it was because of work as she has never worked. A few weeks passed and my boss promoted me. I was happy with my promotion, but it meant that I had to be in another office for the first few days. I used to come to pick up my wife. But then she insisted she would go home by herself. One day I decided to take my wife out for lunch during lunch break. I went to her office, but she wasn't there. When I asked the senior assistant where my wife was, she told me that my wife had gone out with my boss. I called her but she didn't respond. I asked the senior assistant if they attended a meeting, but she said there was no meeting out of nowhere. I remembered that we both usually keep our location on. So the other one knows it was my wife's idea. I checked her location and it showed that she was at my boss's house. I got a little suspicious. I went there but the security didn't let me in. I told them to call my wife. And after several minutes, she came out and looked at me as if she had seen a ghost. I asked her what she was doing there. She told me that some paperwork needed to be done. I then noticed that a few buttons on her shirt were unbuttoned. And at that moment I knew that my wife was cheating on me. I told her we needed to go home and she followed me on our way home. I kept thinking about everything that had happened and it all made sense. Now she told me she had to go to a meeting with our boss out of the city today. I wanted to lash at her, but I had other plans. I wanted revenge. I kept calm and said it was okay and that I would take care of our son. When we went home, my wife went straight to the washroom. I wanted to confront and shame her. But before I could do that, I wanted revenge. I took her phone and typed in the PIN. To my surprise, my wife hadn't changed the PIN. I quickly looked at her messages and saw that she was texting my boss. I took screenshots of their texts and then quickly sent them to me. I then deleted my chat from her phone. Out of curiosity, I scrolled and discovered they had intimate photos together. I wonder how long all of this has been happening. Rage overpowered me. I also sent myself those photos and threw my wife's phone on the wall. She came out of the washroom and I lashed out at her. I confronted her and she started pleading, but I pushed her away. I told her she'll now know what it feels like to be broke. I stormed out, drove straight to the office and showed her the evidence of their affair. The company had strict rules, so they instantly took action. I was given a bonus for getting them caught. The company fired them and I filed for divorce in court. My wife tried to get custody of our son, but I had evidence that she had a drinking problem. And thus the court decided in my favor and I got my son's custody. However, my wife was allowed to meet him on weekends under my supervision. My son said he was glad to be with me because his mother avoided him and never listened. I was furious at her. She was indulged in lust that she ignored her child to my son. But things got better. And me and my son lived together happily. A few months passed and I dedicated all my attention to work. I got a promotion and was now in my boss's position. I had everything he had and what my wife wanted. Somehow my wife came to know about this. When she came to meet our son on weekends, she tried to seduce and win me over, but I was done with her games. My wife lost all her friends and now lives in a shabby apartment and couldn't get a decent job because of her previous records. Oh, Pei, first of all, I want to say that you didn't deserve what happened to you. Even if you are not rich. I think you have a heart of cold. You're trying to please your wife, but she was never happy. She seems to be an ungrateful woman who will never be satisfied. You should have known that she was cheating on you when she made that reservation. But as it said, love is blind. Your revenge was epic. She deserved to be thrown back into her darkness. Thank you for sharing this great story with us. I wish you all the best going forward. Thank you all for taking the time to listen to today's story. If you enjoyed listening, please feel free to like and subscribe. If you haven't already, also comment below with your thoughts.